Good evening, everybody. And I would just like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. When I was thinking of what I would say tonight, I recalled the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is found in Luke 10:25-27. And when we look at that context, it's Jesus' reply to a lawyer who in those days wasn't a lawyer like I was, but a person experienced in the law traditionally given to Moses. And in that law, the Torah, they believed that it contained 613 mitzvot or laws, which was meant as a guide for the people on how to create a society where all people can live in dignity, faithful to the covenant made with their loving God. This was in contrast to the slavery and oppression they had experienced in Egypt. And Scripture has many references to God's loving action in rescuing them and how they are commanded to act as God acted. And so this lawyer is probably a very good person, following the teachings he knew so well. And when he's asked what he must do to inherit eternal life, he answers Jesus with the same reply Jesus himself is given when teaching, which is the greatest commandment. In fact, many rabbis and lawyers at that time summed up the 613 mitzvot under two main commandments. The first is called the Shema, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, quoting Deuteronomy 6, verses 4-5. And if you go into a Jewish home, you'll often find a little mezuzah on their door, which they touch when they go in. And they say this prayer twice a day. So it's a basis of their relationship with God. And the second part of the answer was to love your neighbour as yourself, which was quoting Leviticus 19, verse 17. If you read that same chapter and look at the mitzvot in it, you'll find that they have issues such as not taking the whole harvest, not taking all the grapes from the vine, but to leave some for the poor to come along and have later. The laws are not stealing, paying just wages on time, caring for the blind and deaf, and even that you should not hate your neighbour in your heart. And so that question of who is my neighbour is a perennial question. How do we love God and love neighbour in our contemporary context? The words of Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II challenge us, stating that the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. So in this parable, Jesus is telling the story of a Samaritan man. And the Samaritans and the people of Judea had a mutual hatred, basically over religious differences of where God dwelt, whether it was on Mount Gerizim or Mount Zion, the site of the Jewish temple. But we notice from this parable that the Samaritan sees the injured person with both eyes and heart. He was blind to cultural, religious, or any other differences, and he felt immense compassion. This moved him to action, and an action which involved others, the innkeeper, in order to restore the person to health. The Samaritan wasn't concerned with his own safety. Obviously, this was a dangerous place of robbers, and the Samaritan quite clearly had money, being able to pay for the needs of the injured person, making him a potential victim also. We see too the element of trust in the innkeeper, who took the person in and had to rely on the words of the Samaritan that he would come back and pay any debt incurred. So when I talk about evangelization, I'm talking about how we show God's love, particularly for the poor, the injured or overlooked, the other, how we welcome them and how we join together in restoring a society and situation where those marginalised can be healed and live in dignity as children of God. This is the basis of our rich tradition on social teachings, which emphasises the common good and the dignity of each person, the message of the Exodus event. Basically, this forms an insight into why I went to the Philippines and why I was forced to leave by the former President Duterte. Before I went there, I was working as a lawyer in the more common sense, not like the lawyer in the biblical passage mentioned earlier. I'd chosen to do law after being a parish worker in an area where there were many single mothers who were exploited by various officials and particularly by house-to-house merchants. It was also an area where a group of young people lived on the streets and were constantly in conflict with authorities. Apart from linking the mothers to existing services and help setting up things like financial counselling service, legal service, we as a community considered these people as our friends and learned so much from them. We hoped to help them discover the love of God for each one, and in return also found our own faith, love and joy increasing. And it's a long story how I got involved in the Philippines, and it was really when I was overseas in Israel and found someone who really seemed to know what liberation theology was about from there. But I finished up there after a general chapter of our congregation, in which we were talking about the importance of seeing the world through the eyes of the poor. When we looked at ourselves as a congregation, we realised we were not in Asia, where the majority of the world's population lived, and where the majority were poor. Australia was given the task of addressing this, and we in Australia decided if we were to see the world through the eyes of the poor, we needed to set up a community in Asia. So after a process of discernment, we decided on the Philippines and went to a rural area where the majority of the poor were to be found. After a time of enculturation, walking up and down mountains and things, I was invited by the bishop of the diocese where we were living to become part of the diocesan justice and peace group. It meant a lot of travel in the province on all sorts of transport and staying with the families. I discovered the generosity of the people. There were no mobile phones in the early days. You just arrived at a house of someone you knew, and they would always offer what little food they had and share their one-room home where we all slept on the floor together usually. Many in this diocese had problems with the ownership of the land they had been farming for many years. And I was always amazed by their generosity when they shared part of the produce with us. And it was always a point of gratitude and praise of God. My initial years there were a time of discovering the massive injustices in the lives of these rural farmers, fisherfolk and Indigenous people. It was wonderful to see their confidence and dignity increase as we helped them discover their legal and moral rights when they joined together to speak up. It reminded me of the encouragement of Pope John the 23rd for agricultural workers to form associations, saying it was necessary if farm workers are to have their proper voice in political circles and in public administration. The lone voice is not likely to command much of a hearing in times such as ours. So they had to join together, and that was in Mata Magistra. This learning continued when I finally moved to become the national coordinator of the rural missionaries of the Philippines under the Association of Major Religious Superiors in the Philippines. We were struggling to make the issue of the rural poor central to the life and mission of the church. I saw such a difference when we could help with sustainable agricultural methods as the farmers organised and became active and struggling to get control of the land they tilled, or the Indigenous students in Mindanao whose communities were constantly under attack. They were forever being displaced, but despite being displaced, I saw their confidence grow as they learned together in bringing their cry for their ancestral lands to political and religious groups. We didn't ask what was their religion, but tried to show that God's love is unbounded. I had many Muslim friends and learned much about them in joining with them in their struggle for their ancestral lands, as well as standing with them in a climate of prejudice where they were labelled as terrorists. It was also a rich time of working with other Christian churches. We held ecumenical prayer services among workers on strike, among farmers commemorating massacres of their friends and families who had been struggling for land, among urban poor who had been tear-gassed and their homes demolished. We reflected and prayed together for peace and held various fora and prayer services for peace and the release of political prisoners. We prayed together to discern how our churches could be prophetic in an ever-growing repressive situation, how we could see Christ in these poor, deprived and oppressed, and walk with them, showing and being shown the love of God for each of us. I later read the Vademecum, or the letter of the bishops in 2021, reminding that ecumenism is integral to our church life and that interfaith solidarity is needed. Pope Francis said, Christian unity is not just some sort of appendix added to the church's traditional activities. Rather, it is an organic part of her life and work, and consequently must pervade all that she is and does. He talks of how study and prayer together must lead to a change of heart and a more dynamic and visible witness to the gospel. He points out that a united voice, particularly of church leaders, or respect for the rights and needs of all, including the earth itself, has more impact than one voice, like with the farmers, like with the workers. Personally, I found my work with the people of other faiths and traditions to be both enriching and learning more about their religions, but also a challenge to deepen my own knowledge of my own tradition. I also remember awakening to the rights of our Mother Earth and the link with the concern for the poor. I can remember often travelling to one of the towns in the diocese, which was reached by a bus going along a very windy and bumpy road. Just before reaching the town, there was a mountain, and when I was first there, I thought it was so beautiful. It looked like a smooth green carpet, and then you'd see the sea appear between mountain ridges. Later, when there was a landslide, I discovered how this beautiful smooth mountain was once forest, which had been so thoroughly logged that there were now no trees to hold the soil when there was a torrential download. The soil swept down, covering the farms of the small farmers, polluting the waterways of the fisherfolk. Indigenous people were displaced. I also remember travelling between towns in this province, and I used to watch the mountains. They change colour depending on the season, depending on the time of day, being just so entranced by it. But then a little bit of investigation, and I discovered that these mountains were to be targeted for mining. These were the ancestral lands of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, which gave life to their culture, religion and livelihood. These lands were also their pharmacy. They knew which plants to use for which illness, their supermarket providing food, and a resting place of their ancestors. It didn't have a dollar value. I became more aware and convinced to join them in their move to preserve their ancestral lands, especially when a little more research showed that in the diocese, it was Australian mining companies involved. My involvement with the poor in the Philippines led me to join in facilitating trainings in sustainable agriculture or marketing to look for funding for seeds and farm equipment and other projects which could help the farmer, fisherfolk and Indigenous in particular to some economic basis which was healthy and productive. And it was a real joy to see farmers who were still poor but for the first time had their own produce. Yet I also saw many of these, while pursuing these projects, were facing forces which wanted to displace them from their lands, to exploit their poverty. And unfortunately, the police and military often took the side of the oppressor be they local or foreign oppressors. This led me to also stand with the people in dialogues for land and human rights, and to join rallies where there were massacres, environmental degradation, exploitation of workers. I visited the families of people who had loved ones killed because they were accused of taking drugs, or activists defending the environment, or asking for the rights of their brother and sister farmers, Indigenous, workers, or even poor. I was incensed when I saw their dignity walked on, and wanted to build a society where the common good of all was the primary concern, which we would refer to as God's kingdom on earth. Given that I'd been doing the same thing for 28 years, that I'd lived in the Philippines, it came as some shock when I was arrested by the Bureau of Immigration and advised I would be deported. The grounds that I wasn't doing missionary work as per my missionary visa, and they define missionary as a person who has been sent to a foreign country to teach their religion to the people there, whose mission is to go somewhere to help others. In many cases, the goal of the missionary is to teach about religion so that people can convert to their faith. And I think they got it from Google. Then there are several points where this definition raised problems in terms of evangelization. Firstly, Google hadn't read Vatican II, and since Vatican II, in particular the document Nostra Aetate, in it we are called to see the beauty and truth in each religion and religious tradition. Until now, we consider ecumenical and interfaith dialogue as something which our world, wounded by conflict and division, increasingly needs, and that was a recent statement of the Pope. Our witness becomes a common stand for justice, peace, and dignity of each person and the rights of all creation, and not a competition for numbers or a monopoly on truth. So our mission becomes a conversion of our own hearts and the hearts of others to be open and listen to the cry of the poor and respond in the same way that the Samaritan did. The encyclicals and quotes from the compendium on the social doctrines of the church, to my surprise, became part of my defence and were introduced by my lawyers. The main lawyers were not Catholic. One was a Methodist and another an Anglican, but they were very fond of Pope Francis. When the charge was added that my being in solidarity with the farmers, fisherfolk, Indigenous people, urban poor, political prisoners, and joining with them in various activities was political and a breach of my missionary visa, they discovered several quotes from the Pope and from the compendium, such as, if indeed the just ordering of society and the state is the central responsibility of politics, the church cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. That's in the Evangelium Gaudium. He says that an authentic faith, which is never comfortable or completely personal, always involves a deep desire to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this earth somehow better than we found it. In fact, Pope Francis says that Christian conversion demands reviewing, especially those areas and aspects of life related to the social order and the pursuit of the common good. And so the argument we were saying was, it's not only a duty, it's a responsibility of the church to be involved in politics, but as a foreigner, not party politics, but there's quite a difference between being political and being party political. Pope Francis has clearly shown that spreading the social doctrine is part of the church's evangelization. And I have to say, one of the charges against me was I had spoken to a group who had been Coca-Cola workers, contracted, had no rights to sick leave, holiday pay, etc. They're low wages. They wanted to talked to Coke about being put on permanent, and they were sacked. And then a picket they held was brutally broken up. And I had spoken to them when some of them had, in public, when some of them had just got out of jail. Now, when I saw the charge of the Bureau of Immigration, that turned out, I had said, apart from their constitution, the Catholic social teachings say workers have a right to strike, they have a right to a decent salary, decent conditions, and that turned out to be subversive of it. And I'd also learned from my experience that while projects were helpful in the short term, because they needed the sustainable agriculture, they needed some help with seeds, but in the long term, not enough to enable a true and lasting dignity and freedom for those oppressed and exploited. I discovered very quickly that I also needed to work with them for systemic change. Our social teachings have been pointing at this for years, and Pope Francis puts very clearly in all his writings that this is urgent, and only through systemic changes can we cure the world's ills, with inequality being the root of all social ills. And that's also from Evangelio Gaudium. So if we return to the parable of the Good Samaritan, then we ask ourselves, how do we respond to the wounded in our society? Do we hear the cry of the earth, which is so intimately linked with the cry of the poor and displaced? Are we prepared to be neighbour to those most needing experience of God's love in their lives? And where we also discover greater love of God and a developing relationship with Jesus as we get closer to those who are most needing our love. And I think in a globalised community now, a globalised world now, it's both the neighbour that we see very close to us, but it's also the neighbour that we may not see. Like asylum seekers, we may be able to do something in our area, but we may not. We may find some other way of responding to them, even if it's through keeping them in our hearts and prayers. But how do we work politically to push the issue of the unfair visa system? Khalid is asking about the Catholic Migrant Refugee Office, but that's a joint project trying to get the parishes to take in the seasonal workers who were in a pretty bad situation and still are in a lot of cases, and parishes have done things like everything from inviting them in to have an afternoon tea to get to know the community, to ACRAF working on a case where some workers from Nauru weren't paid their wages and helping them with the legal case. And of course, we have the whole thing of the Indigenous and their invitation to us to walk with them through the statement of the heart. We can do things like even how we buy things. ACRAF has a program helping us to be aware that where our clothes come from, are the workers being exploited? So that there are loads of ways that we can open our hearts to our neighbour that we see it, to our neighbour that we may not see, but to be moved by it, to allow it to touch our heart. And so I'd just like to end with one quote from Pope Francis, sets us a challenge. Even if many are now involved in lay ministries, this involvement is not reflected in greater penetration of the Christian values in social, political and economic sectors. It often remains tied to tasks within church without real commitment to applying the gospel to the transformation of society. The pastoral challenge I see now to the church and all people of goodwill today, not to be silenced in the face of massive human rights violations. We must defend the dignity of the human person and the common good. In the face of the many injustices today, we are called to be people of courage and hope, people who know that the light always overcomes the darkness, that justice, peace and truth will win, but this does not come easily. Our missionary task is to struggle with those who are victims, to eliminate the structural causes of poverty, and to promote integral development guided by the gospel of mercy and by love for humankind. We must hear the cry for justice and respond to it with all our might. And I think we don't have to be wonder workers, that each of us, how do we, who is on the margins, what do they need, and how do we make social justice a reality for them? How do we listen to one another and listen together with the eyes and ears of loving and being loved by God? And how do we learn from one another and with one another to help each other internalise the hopes, joys, anxieties of the other, to make them our own and act with them through our church and others to witness to God's reign now. So thank you.